was also a different time. You know, like consumerism has changed, and what we consider fun, and you know, if cell phones existed and DoorDash existed, I'm sure busy families would have used DoorDash in a pinch in the 80s as well. You know, you're a product of your time. But yeah, dude, that's such a good breakdown, because then the wealth hoarding just began. It's kind of wild. I'll tell you, the most crazy statistic to me is that in the 1980, I don't know exactly what year, but let's say $40 trillion of wealth adjusted for inflation. And today in 2025, we have 170 trillion. So it has gone up $130 trillion. But the sad part, when you talk about trickle down, only 2 trillion of the 130, only 2 made its way. Isn't that wild? And you look at the bottom 50%, there's 175 million Americans in the bottom 50, and they share $5 trillion of wealth.
Okay, boomer. Buying Starbucks, and they just need to stop eating. Z, they just need to work hard, get a job, and just go to college, just like the rest of us did. Gen X, who's Gen X? This is basically what we hear all the time, day in, day out. Whether you're on social media, whether you are, you know, in public talking to somebody, whether you're in private talking to somebody got something to always to say about which generation, right? And who's involved in each generation. The problem is this fault. This particular generation has that fault, and it's going on. There's 2 gentlemen that actually had a conversation that I really want to get into and react to, because I think that it is best for us to start looking at it from a class perspective, as well as I think one of the biggest issues is we're seeing past each other and not seeing each other. And so I also want to kind of fill in some of the gaps that I think that they missed a little bit in this conversation. Granted, I do not have this gentleman's Patreon, so I didn't get to listen to the entire conversation on patron-only stream for this. This is basically the clip version that he posted on YouTube. So we'll just be reacting to this. But I think there's some points that were missed upon that I want to fill the gaps in. But he makes a lot of great points in this as well. So this is from Damon Cassidy. He says, why every generation keeps getting poorer. So we're going to get into this. And I'm not going to watch the entire video because I want you guys to finish it up on yourself. But I want to talk about some key points.
While Gen Z faces an American dream that now costs over $100,000 a year in all 50 states, forced to navigate the most expensive housing market in history and a dollar worth 86% less than it was for baby boomers, it's easy to forget that during the 1980s, boomers also endured one of the largest reductions in real wages since the Great Depression, a housing market that saw prices increased by over 85%, factories closing as millions of jobs were outsourced overseas, all while the nation remained consumed by the Cold War and the aftermath of Vietnam. Well, in order to understand the root of the nation's growing generational divide, I spoke with Freddie Smith, a real estate agent and associate broker who has built a career exposing the data behind America's generational inequality and the rising cost of living, where he broke down which generation has actually had it worse and why we continue to ignore the real culprits behind this economic collapse.
The boomer advice is typically to, you need to save your money, stop with the coffee, stop with all the stuff, quit buying TVs and phones because you need to save, because luxuries in the 1980s were actually really expensive. So they were living in because we do have the luxuries of being able to have multiple teams. They had, their rent, however, was probably around $200 to $250, which was very cheap. But if they wanted to buy 3 TVs like most families have today, they're $1,000 a piece back in the 80s. So it'd be $3,000. A CD player was $500, a cell phone was $2,000, a computer was $2,500, a microwave was $500. Them $8,500 to buy that, which would be equivalent to 3.5 times their rent, 3.5 years their rent. So yeah, and $8,500 is also equivalent to a 20% down payment on a $40,000 home.
So let's start here, because this is something that a lot of people don't take into consideration, which I think was actually a really good analysis here. And so one of the things that I think about, my grandmother, right? First came out, she was one of the first people to actually own the microwave. And I remember that microwave. Number one, that microwave cooked fast. That was a microwave, okay? But also remember when Grandma and Pop used to have the 4 model TV? You know how expensive those 4 model TVs were? They were so expensive that you didn't get a new one if something wrong happened to it. You got it repaired. Right? You didn't go out and get a new one. You got, look, and you be passing those shops at TV repair. Yep. And so when it came to televisions, when it came to just look at the prices, how much for the first video, which was basically this Nintendo and Super Nintendo, right? Remember how expensive those were? Like, even go back to the 90s, a Sony PlayStation was $400 in the 90s money. You know how expensive that would be today? That's the equivalent of somewhere north of $900. A PS5 is about half that much. And so you think about like a lot of the money that were spent on things that were considered luxuries back then, but now it's considered standard today. Like, you have to have a computer, right? I'll give you guys a full disclosure. My computer cost me $450, right? I got it when we had the stimulus check from Biden during the pandemic. That's when I got my computer. I actually used stimulus money to get this computer. Great investment, right? But my computer, with the amount of memory and everything that it has today, this computer easily would have been $2,500 to $3,000 in the 1980s, right? So necessities were cheap. Luxuries were expensive. And now we're seeing a flip where luxuries are cheap, but necessities are expensive, and things have flipped. And I think this is what's important. Let's continue.
If you think about like the boomers thinking of this, going, if you have 3 TVs, a cell phone, a computer, because we couldn't have any of that, that was our 20% down payment for our house, or that was 3.5 years of our rent on those luxuries. Where today, 3 TVs, music and Netflix, $100, music, Netflix, and subs, say $100, a cell phone $1,000, a computer can be $500, microwave $200, is $2,400. And our rent is typically around $2,000. So it's essentially all those luxuries that were equivalent to a 20% down payment for them equals about one month is our luxury now. And the final button on it, for the average house, you would need probably around $60,000 for a down payment. So the 2,400, if you just didn't have any TVs, no subs, no cell phone, no computer, no microwave, you would still be 60 grand short of a 20% down payment.
I want you guys to gauge exactly the powerful point he made. Your necessities are now your luxury. Rent is now a luxury. Luxury. Right? Your electric bill is becoming a luxury, especially now since we have all these AI data centers that are popping up. The necessities are the luxuries now. You can jam to music. You can have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 songs in your tiny little device here, right? But even though you can barely live where you're at because you can't afford the rent, when back in the day, in the 80s, you either had, a record player with the turntable, and then you had all those records, and all those records cost, collectively like $600, $700, $800, right? Even more. Or, you had a stereo with a nice tape deck, or you had the boom box, which you kind of also constantly had. Your luxuries cost more, but at least you can afford food. At least you can afford electricity. At least you can afford your rent. God. Yeah, I got music on my phone, but I'll be out in the street. Let's continue on. Great points by him.
Changed,
Great
but
points.
back in the 80s, even though the luxuries were expensive, things like education and healthcare, cars, gas, like everything was cheaper. The necessities were cheaper.
One of the other things that I think about is, so you were raised during a period of time where your dollar was worth something. There was peace and prosperity for the most part. and so quickly that went away. There's a statistic where the dollar lost about 53.7% of its value between 1970 and 1980. That's 10% more than we've experienced the last 2 decades. And so we've seen that since the loss of labor unions, wages just aren't even remotely close. Pensions started to get degraded during that period of time. Minimum wage was not raised once during Ronald Reagan's era. And because so many jobs were outsourced during that period of time, in Reagan's 2 terms, were predominantly in service-related industries. And we can see we are now a service economy. We don't have that manufacturing base that we once had. And because we were also in that unique period of time to where everybody kind of needs to go to college, but high school still meant something, but blue collar doesn't mean anything now. A lot of these high school graduates that couldn't afford to go to college either were having to deal with the ramifications of the Vietnam War and trying to recover from that, or they were going into service-related jobs, and they just were never able to get they weren't able to live a part of the same economy that the people that could afford to go to college, that could afford to do some of these other things that we've heard about. And that's what's so important, to acknowledge the fact of there's so many different categories of the baby boomer generation because they're so big. Everything, but also just the fact that the dollar could purchase something for you is something that we have to admit. Even though you lost 50%, we've
that's another great point, is that to somebody who's a baby boomer, oh my God, you spent $8 on a meal? Back then, $8 could get me 3 or 4 meals. What? Why are you spending your money so loosely? When in reality, try to find a meal for less than $8. You can't find it because the dollar has lost so much value to the point now where you have to spend that much. Even boomers underestimated how much more expensive things would get. This is why a lot of boomers are actually returning to work now, because their retirement is running out. And it's not just that because they're living longer, but because things have gotten so expensive to the point where they can't even afford to continue. And these boomers have Medicare, but then they got to pay that 20% that Medicare doesn't cover. They may have a house, but because of growing expenses, they may have to take out, equity out of their house in order to be able to pay for some things that's absolutely necessary. And a lot of people think, oh, boomers had it good. Not all. A lot of boomers did not have it good. A good chunk of them had it better than we did, but a lot of them didn't have it that good. So I want to dismiss with that, because there's a lot of boomers that are still going through it, still worried about housing, still worried about healthcare, still worried about transportation, and worried about being able to make their rent next month, on top of still trying to learn new technology that has whisked by them during their working years because they were so busy just learning email. Now they're like, oh my God, what the hell is this social media now? And so it's gotten that deep. So I see a lot of people blaming boomers, and some of the people who are responsible for what has happened, they may be of boomer age, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to blame every person that is part of a particular generation, because it's not the generation as a whole that has done horrible things to keep the system that it is in place. And some of those people are also part of Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z. So it's not exclusive to just boomers. Let's continue on.
I think that's fair. I think that's how we have to look at the generations, because it wasn't a cakewalk. I think sometimes when we critique the boomers, they're quick to be like, it was not easy. Like, what are you talking about? And it's like, we just mean the cost of living to wages, essentially, is all we mean. We know that your houses were smaller and you had no air conditioning and you were going through all of this other shit now in our own, like, Americans are a little, as much as things are are expensive, we aren't going through as much here as people were back in the day. But it was also a different time. Like, consumerism has changed, and what we consider fun, and if cell phones existed and DoorDash existed, I'm sure busy families would have used DoorDash in a pinch in the 80s as well. You're a product of your time. But yeah, dude, that's such a good breakdown, because then the wealth hoarding just began. It's kind of wild. I'll tell you, the most crazy statistic to me is that in the 1980, I don't know exactly what year, but let's say $40 trillion of wealth adjusted for inflation. And today in 2025, we have 170 trillion. So it has gone up $130 trillion. But the sad part, when you talk about trickle down, only 2 trillion of the 130, only 2 made its way. Isn't that wild? And you look at the bottom 50%, there's 175 million Americans in the bottom 50, and they share $5 trillion of wealth. The top 10% have 110 trillion. And a lot of those top 10 percenters, hardworking folks that played the system. I'm not saying that, but the top 1%, the top 1%, I think the top 1% actually holds 50 trillion. The top 1% with 3.5 million people.
Okay, so I'm going to slightly disagree. I don't think the top 10% actually worked that much harder than the rest of us. I don't think they did. I think that they just got a bigger chunk of the pie while the rest of us are continuing to be exploited. See, here's the thing. We always blame the billionaires, which rightly so, but we also got to blame the 100 millionaires too. We got to blame them too. We got to blame the people who are, who have net worths, who are making 7, 8, and 9 figures. We gotta put the heat on them too. Not just the billionaires, but the people who make 7, 8, and 9 figures too. We gotta put the heat on them too. Because a huge chunk of them, they didn't get there by just working hard either. Let's call a thing. And there's only 10% of them. So, a lot of people, it's not the whole, they worked hard for what they got. That's debatable because a lot, 99% of all of us at the bottom
percent. I think the top 1% actually holds 50 trillion. The top 1, then the bottom 175 million people combined. And that's just what I point to and go, I'm not for socialism or capitalism. I'm for the system we have. If you would 50 years, that would have organically given 20% of what you have.
Let me continue.
Million, you've only got 80 million. You don't have 10 million, you have 8 million. Nothing changes. But if they would have used that 20% difference in stock options and stock programs, in financial education, we all would have been lifted up. So it's like, that's the whole thing, like the trickle down. It was just like, they just kept doing everything they could for shareholders and for profits. And around the 80s, it really did feel, I'm curious your take on this. I don't think it was anyone to like point fingers. It was like kind of a collective maybe, but it felt like we might have had a country, the United States of America, up until the 80s. And then it was almost like sold off for parts to become a corporation. Like now I think we're like America Inc., where it's.
Okay, so let me break something. Here's the thing. Technically, you are for capitalism. The reason why is because you want to put guard. You are a reformist, basically meaning you want to keep the same system in place, but you just don't want people to be exploited as much. You still to keep some exploitation in place, but you don't want it harsh. That's the problem when it comes to this system, is that automatically it's going to exploit. It's like trying to put bridles on a wild horse. Eventually, you're never going to get control of that horse, and it's going to shake that bridle off eventually. It's just a matter of time. And the problem is that you can say, oh, whoa, wait, we'll make it so that they give 20%. Guess what? They did that already. It was called the New Deal, and they actually reversed everything. They did that. Was the period of the strongest economic growth in this country for the most people. And guess what? It got reversed when we hit 1970. And reversal was on a slight decline. It was rolling and rolling and rolling. And by the time Ronnie Reagan decided to put his diseased toe into the White House, guess what? Between him and down way fast, and there was no stopping him. And so that's exactly what happened. So what he's proposing is going back to between what we had in 1950 to 1970. But dude, I'm here to tell you, we ain't going back, because this system will not allow it. Because the system of capitalism is predicated on the consistent and constant exploitation of the people who are at the bottom. So you can say, oh, we just want to, you just don't have $100 million, you just got 80. That means that even with that 80%, that means they still exploit it to get that 80%. The problem isn't the amount, the problem is the system itself. And this is the problem that some people have when it comes to understanding things. They think, oh, well, and I'm not going to give you third-degree burns. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you first-degree burns. I'm just going to give you third-degree burns. But we don't want to be burned in the first place. We've already been stabbed in the back. Why are you only going to, we've already been stabbed in the back with a 9-inch knife. Why are you going to only pull it out 3 inches and say, well, there's only 6 inches in your back now? Keep your head down in the gutter, some of y'all. I know y'all. But here's the thing. Why in the world are we going to accept that the knife is still in our back? No, it's not just the degree of how bad we're being exploited. It's that we're being exploited in the first place. And so he goes, I'm not for capitalism or socialism. No, you're not for capitalism. You just want a kinder, gentler capitalism. But kinder, gentler capitalism did happen, and then it got reversed. And by the way, while we're talking about this, it will not be missed upon me, but these are 2 white guys. And so what they're talking from is a lived experience from what they and their parents have experienced within this country. But that was not the reality for a lot of us that have a little bit more melanin in our skin that existed in this country at that time. So what happened to the rest of us? Were we doing so well? Not even between the 1950s to the 1970s. We may have been doing a little bit better, but we did not have no equality. Might I remind you exactly what was going on between 1950 and 1970? If you want to do a history lesson, you can go ahead and look, and you can see exactly what happened. And so was America great for everybody between that time? No, 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 no. We literally had to march in the streets while having water cannons sprayed on us. What happened in 1985 just because we tried to actually change the system? What happened in the 1960s and 1970s with a group of people who just so happened to have a little bit more melanin in their skin? They wore all black and they started feeding their communities. What happened to them? Well, wasn't it the police and the FBI that actually murdered them in cold blood, or put them in prison, or exiled them to other countries, or had them forced to exile to other countries just so that they can stay alive? Because we tried to dare change to a system that was beyond what we were living in? Do we remember the crack epidemic? And so, yeah, I get it, right? Things were a little bit better for some, but there's still wealth inequality. And also, on top of it, the social safety nets that were already in place were gutted out. And a lot of those social safety nets were now gone. And it was a bipartisan effort between Democrats and Republicans, which shows how both parties are trash. I just wanted to put that out there.
Corporation. Like now I think we're like America Inc., where it's like I don't think the corporations see us as workers and numbers on a page, not as humans. The media sees us as consumers. How do we keep your attention so that Dove soap and Aveeno will pay us more attention? You're a consumer. And politicians see us as voters. Like the three most powerful entities don't see us as human beings. They kind of pander to us and say, we really care about, getting your wages up and everything. It's like every decision you make is for the GDP to keep growing and capitalism to keep. That's the most frustrating thing to me, is like anytime I hear a politician or a media person be like our country, I go, what you mean is you mean capitalism. Replace country with capitalism, and then everything they say will make sense.
Yeah.
One of the things he's referring to is really just a slow dissension back into creating slow dissension into restoring humans back to the status of chattel. The only difference is it will not be just melanin amount, but it will be all workers. Ultimately. Because right now, that's what, and so what is that extra step? Oh, it's going to get to a point where they're not even going to care anymore. They're just going to be like, get your ass back to work, or we're going to put you in the box. Because we refuse to say that this capitalist system does not work. And we need to fight and create a completely brand new system. And there's no that's actually going to get us in a place where we are actually dignified, have equality, equity, and equality. That's the thing, man.
Say will make sense.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality is, even when we talk about the declining birth rate, is we talk about the impact that's going to have on the economy. It isn't people aren't wanting to have kids. There's a reason why in America there's so many things. It's in 20 to 30 years the economy isn't going to be able to do as good because there is as many people. It's like, who gives a shit? It's like the economy has done nothing for us in the past 40, 50 years. Why do we talk about it as if it's something actually doing anything for us? I think that's the same thing of, talking about corporations can't afford to do a higher minimum wage, or they're gonna have to increase prices. And it's like, Well, the Starbucks CEO is making like 900% more than their staff. He doesn't need to make 900% more, whatever the number is. There's money around. The stock price can maybe be $5 less. There's some of these things. It's like it's just so absurd how we are justifying their actions.
So the whole thing about Gen Z not having kids is really a concern by the parasite class, because remember what I said, that wage slavery is just chattel slavery with a few extra steps? Well, that means that they're concerned with what one person who was an advisor to the president said, basically meaning that since you guys aren't having enough kids, we don't have enough workers to exploit. And so they have an answer for that. It's called AI. It's called automation, so that they won't need as many humans to be able to do these jobs. So therefore, if you guys actually stop having kids, well, we got an answer for that. We don't need y'all anymore. We just have robots to do what we need. Uh-oh. And that's the point, right? Let me see. Let's go here, and then we'll finish up. I'm not going to be able to do this whole thing, but I just want to get to this part about Gen X, because this is the generation that is not regarded as much as they should be. But let's go
back to not understanding the data. And one of the things is, and I find it a lot. I speak a lot about baby boomers, and sometimes I feel like it's a bit hopeless to do. I just feel like we just are in such different periods of time. I don't have the ability to talk for 3 hours and really try to have an actual conversation. And so it's like, even with my best efforts, I feel like it's a failed attempt at times. I truly think that the generation that we need to try to communicate the most with is actually Generation X. When you look at Generation X, they're raised by baby boomers that were having to work. They spent their entire lives working, so they're latchkey kids. You emerge into adulthood during the dot-com bubble, where it is factually proven that if you were laid off in the tech field, you were never able to overcompensate for that loss. So you could be 25 years old and you were never able to make as much as the person that just so happened to enter the finance industry or something like that. And so immediately you are already now at a lower tier in terms of just kind of the growth of Generation X. You then have to go through 9/11 and the wars that followed that. You then go into the recession. You lose the most amount of wealth out of any single generation. You then come out of that. In your peak earning years, you experience the pandemic. And now you're having to take care of your aging parents as well as your kids, and the most expensive time ever. To talk about the number and the data with all of these things, they are somebody that around 2000, if they were about 30 years old, or kind of in the middle range of the Generation X age range, they were going to be making an average salary of about $35,296, or about $68,000 today. So, that would be a good salary today. They weren't doing too bad 2000 if they weren't in the tech industry. If you're around the average age range and you had a normal career of about 2.5% annual wage boost, which you'd kind of have to be lucky to even be able to get that for a lot of the industries that they were in. But if you were able to get about a 2.5% annual wage increase, you would now be making $65,300 today. So you're making less than you would be making in 2000. What they perceive it as is, I'm making double. You're actually making less because inflation has destroyed the wage increases that you have. I think when you tell a generation that has been hosed in almost every single regard, and they're having to work, and they're having to face the fact of, I'm having to take care of everybody. Nobody has ever respected me. And now I might get laid off for all of the many reasons. And I'm making less my entire career. If you can get those people to say, we need to be able to kind of know how to navigate systems and stuff like that, that's where the change is made. And for many, millennials and Gen Z, our parents are Gen X. So there's an easier way to be able to communicate with them if you can just break that prickliness. And that's been hard, but I think that, again, to make some sort of improvement for the trajectory that we're facing, we have to be able to get on board with some of these older generations to try to make a difference.
Dude.
The blame game really doesn't work when it comes to saying, oh, it's the boomers' fault, it's Gen X's inaction that's the fault, or it's the millennials' fault, or it's Gen Z's fault. We got to look at it instead of generationally, we got to look at it as who are the ones at the top? Because look, millennial that is a parasite, his name is Mark Zuckerberg, right? Who's Gen X that is a parasite? Well, you have Elon Musk, or you would have somebody like a Harlan Crow. And so the problem is that it's not necessarily a particular class that we have to blame. The you know what I mean? Because we need to be done with them. How many boomers right now are suffering? A lot of boomers are suffering right now. A lot of them get food stamps now because they don't make enough. And what happens on November 1st? Well, the food stamps are going to be running out. And because the food stamps are running out, then guess what? We're going to have a lot of hungry boomers. Same thing with Gen X. Gen X are the ones who are less regarded now. They're a bit more prickly because and trust and believe Gen X. So I am an elder millennial, and elder millennials and young Gen X's were siblings. They're not our parents. And so we kind of see eye to eye on a lot of things generationally. So I think it's important for a lot of us to start looking at it not generation versus generation. It should be top versus bottom, up versus down, the wealthy parasite class versus the rest of us. We have to build solidarity with one another. I think that's how we do it. And the benefit of uniting with boomers and Gen X, for a lot of us millennials, and having class solidarity is that a lot of them have lived long enough to know how things work. They may not. And so it's important for us to have our solidarity with people who have the wisdom and who including have the skepticism that built over the years as be a little bit too what's the word I want to use? We may be a little bit too optimistic, or we may see things through rose-colored glasses still a little bit, like myself, right? So this is why you need people who are a little bit more skeptical, or people who are more realistic, maybe slightly on the verge of pessimistic, in order to keep us grounded. Generations too. You know, and so I'm going to share this video because they go even deeper. And yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. You know, of course, you know, we're not going to agree with everything, but a lot of great points were made here, and I think it's important to get your opinions from different people, different sources. Don't always stay in a bubble. Don't always stay in an echo chamber. So it's important to listen to the perspectives of different people who may have different lived experiences than yourself. So let's continue to unite with, all the workers among us, and let's start to be curious and learn and develop ourselves so that we're not alienating ourselves from other people. This also means growth and humility along with it. But once we do that, look, when we come together, the sky's the limit for the rest of us. And we can finally be rid of these parasites. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you'd like to see any more, you can look here. One, forehead kisses.